point we started to see a pattern forming. Whenever a new Nintendo handheld was released, you could bet to see a new main series Pokemon game on it. And that's exactly what we got with the Nintendo DS in the form of Pokemon Diamond, Pearl and Platinum. Double the screens, double the buttons, and decuple the amount of shovelware, it's the DS, which brought with it the Generation 4 Pokemon games. Around 2 years after the system launched in Japan, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl saw their release in the country on September of 2006. And it was around this time when internet video content started to grow in quantity and popularity. I remember seeing people upload full playthroughs of the Japanese versions onto the internet well before their localized releases. I had patience and didn't spoil much of the game for myself leading up to the European release of July 2007. And like clockwork, an enhanced version of the game, Pokemon Platinum, debuted in September 2008. Not to discount some of the technical marvels that we saw on previous Nintendo handhelds, but the DS was the first Nintendo handheld to do competent 3D graphics that are somewhat comparable to PS1 or Saturn games. So was it finally time for the mainline Pokemon games to embrace this new dimension? No, of course not. Don't be silly. We all know Game Freak are all about iteration over innovation. Though in this instance, this isn't a bad thing. Many franchises remain 2D when shifting over to the DS. The Generation 4 games look like the evolved form of the Generation 3 games. If I had to sum up the visual difference between these generations in one word, that word would be depth. The game is still top down, but the camera has been shifted slightly so everything looks a lot less flat. Things like buildings and statues now poke upwards toward the screen, making them appear as 3D objects. And while the game is still tile based, they do a better job of disguising this in these games with the 3D objects. The Eterna City Gym even incorporates this new visual design as its main puzzle element. The depth is more prevalent in areas with bridges where there is a clear sense of distance between multiple floors. On the whole, the game looks quite nice, and it's a noticeable step up from previous games, but there is one visual quirk that I noticed with these games. As NPCs get closer or farther away from the camera, their sprites scale to adjust for this, which leads to noticeable warping of the character sprites. I'm not sure there's much that the dev team could have done to prevent this, and to be honest, it wasn't long before I stopped noticing this, or stopped paying attention to it at the very least. The part of the game that is the most glaring offender of this visual quirk is the opening movie with its more cinematic camera, and you probably won't end up watching that more than once anyway. Battle sprites have also seen an upgrade. Although they were mostly quite good in the Game Boy Advance games, the higher resolution of the DS means that the Pokemon and human sprites can display more minute details, and they just look a bit more cleaner and colourful overall. Gen 4 was the generation that introduced sprite differences within species of Pokemon depending on their gender, which is a cool idea. However, most of these differences are so minuscule that you're likely to not even notice a vast majority of them unless you were to examine each one with a fine-tooth comb. A visual choice that I'm not a huge fan of is that the graphics of some moves took on a more realistic style, or at least as realistic as 2D water or fire can look. Some of these stand out a bit too much compared to the cartoony nature of the Pokemon sprites themselves, and to that end I actually prefer some of the cartoonier graphics of these moves in the Generation 3 games. But then there are some moves that retain the cartoony art style, and these moves feel right at home. And of course the most obvious change that your eyes will notice straight away: this game is played across 2 screens. This new form factor opens up a few new options to Pokemon trainers. The Generation 4 games set the control and UI standard that carried over to all DS and 3DS Pokemon games when it comes to battles. All of the battle options appear on the bottom screen and can be controlled with the buttons or with touch controls, while the battle itself takes place on the top screen. It's not a massive change from previous games, but it works well. The touch controls make it quicker to select actions, and the bottom screen is left blank during the Pokemon's turns as to not force the player to constantly change their focus between the screens. Outside of battles, the game plays out on the top screen, and the bottom screen is left blank at the start. But it isn't long before the player picks up a Pokédex, or the Pokéwatch, which is basically this game's Pokégear / Pokénav. And I've got to say, unlike those, the Pokédex is actually cool and has a bunch of useful features. For the most part, I just left it on the Pokemon list to constantly display the status of my team. There were other times where I used other apps to make certain tasks much easier, like the Berry Searcher, the Dowsing Machine, and the Daycare Checker. The Pokédex is a practical and fun use of the second screen, and I definitely appreciated it. Before we start talking about other elements of the games, there is one glaring issue with Diamond and Pearl that I need to address first, and that is the speed of battles. For some bizarre reasons, battles in Diamond and Pearl specifically are insanely slow compared to what came before. It's not really the speed of animations that have changed or anything like that. The games just seem to pause before and after every little thing happens. It didn't bother me too much when I first started playing. I'd say it took about an hour or so to become annoying, which is a pretty short amount of time considering these games are around 30 hours long. Unfortunately, the slow speed was something that I couldn't unnotice, and I'm generally a patient guy when it comes to RPGs. I like playing with animations on, and I like to take my time. But I'd be lying if I said that all of this unnecessary pausing didn't get on my nerves a little. It didn't ruin the game for me, but it might for some. But never fear. Thankfully, Pokemon Platinum rectifies this problem pretty much entirely, reverting the battle speed back to what it was in older games. No pausing, no waiting around. Battles just play as they always should have. This is a definite point in favour of Pokemon Platinum. On the other hand, Platinum made some strange choices when it came to the look of the battle UI on the top screen. Gotta say, I'm not a huge fan of the grey. I explained in my video on Generation 3 that those games were the starting point for what modern Pokemon battles would be in terms of the gameplay mechanics, but there was one aspect of Generation 3's battle system that wasn't at all like it is today, and it was a pretty major one. The one change in Diamond and Pearl greatly improved the battle system and made a ton of Pokemon a hell of a lot less useless. I'm talking about the great physical special attack split of 2006. Previously on Pokemon, certain types of attacks would always count as physical attacks, such as normal or fighting, whereas other types would always count as special, such as water, fire, or grass. This meant that Pokemon like Gyarados or Feraligatr were pretty bad water Pokemon, as their physical attack stat was much higher than their special. But along came Generation 4 to save the day. Now, every attacking move was assigned to either physical or special, regardless of type. Not only does this change greatly help the balance of Pokemon, but it also adds a new layer of strategy, as certain Pokemon will benefit greater from certain moves. Take Luxray, a Pokemon with a higher attack stat than special attack. It would see a greater payout in using a move like Thunder Fang than Thunder Shock. And now, moves like Bite actually make sense, as before they weren't physical, and a bunch of unique moves were implemented thanks to this change, such as the special fighting move Aura Sphere. With this change, Pokemon battles had essentially become what they still are today. Subsequent games would add a few new gimmicks, but there haven't been any core changes as significant as this. Other areas of the game also saw some slight improvements, such as the bag finally being unlimited, so no more having to toss out those nuggets that you keep forgetting to sell. It also came with a bunch of new pockets, and is definitely the best version of the bag we've seen in Pokemon. That ball pocket will likely be full of all the unique balls that make a return from Generation 3, as well as a few new ones, some of them being even more useful. The heal ball kind of sucks, but on the flip side, the quick ball is absolutely busted. Its rate of capture is increased exponentially when used on the first turn, making it super easy to catch a lot of Pokemon without even trying. Even high level evolved Pokemon in some instances. I mean, it's great that it makes the job easier, but I think they went a bit too far in reducing the challenge. The Dusk Ball isn't quite as broken, but is still very useful. It increases your chances of capturing a Pokemon in caves, which means most legendary Pokemon, or at night. Speaking of which, the day and night cycle makes a return, which is fantastic. There are still only 3 set time periods, but the lighting now changes every hour or so, allowing for a more dynamic transition between times of day. Once again, some Pokemon only show up at certain times of day, which is something that was sorely missing from the Gen 3 games. Which day of the week it is also has an impact on certain events too, such as whether you'll meet the balloon Pokemon Drifloon or not. And one of the coolest new features of the Generation 4 games is the multiple instances of teaming up with NPCs. Double battles are still as fun as ever, and being able to partner up with a unique NPC and fight alongside a rare Pokemon that you may have never seen before is a great time. Seeing their Pokemon and fighting styles adds a bit more personality to some of the characters. Plus, some partner trainers will heal your Pokemon after every battle, offering a great moment to easily train your own Pokemon, and hey, I'll take it. Teaming up with other trainers is a great way to interact with other characters, and it's something that wasn't really done much in the older games. And on that note, it feels that the relationships that players build with the human characters was a higher focus for Game Freak this time around than it has been in the past. Be that the case or not, I do find the human characters in the Generation 4 games to be stronger than they were in the past. I like that not only do we get a friendly rival character, but there is another child friend along for the ride in the form of Dawn or Lucas, depending on whether the player chose to be a boy or girl at the start. They're not overly vital to the story and merely serve as a tutorial in most instances, but I like the fact that they're there. It's nice to see a trainer who started before you, who you will quickly surpass while trying to keep up with your rival. And this is where we saw the trend of the friendly rival remain. But I must say that the rival in this game definitely has more personality compared to that of the previous generation. Barry, as he's canonically known by, is a gung-ho young lad who's not afraid to leave you in the dust. I guess in that sense he is a bit of a jerk rival. Despite his inability to defeat the player character, he does very much hold his own against gym leaders and this game's evil team at some points. You've got to respect it. He's not my favourite rival in the series, but I like him enough. And I like that he, as well as Dawn or Lucas, get their moments to shine. An interesting character is Cyrus, the leader of the game's evil team, Team Galactic. In my previous videos, I didn't really discuss the evil team's leaders separate to the teams themselves, as the teams are mainly just an embodiment of the leaders' motives. They're pretty much one and the same. But that's not really the case with Cyrus and Team Galactic. What I find so interesting about Cyrus is that he doesn't care for the team he created, and his plans don't really have much to do with Pokemon, but relate to the state of the galaxy. His grunts hardly even know what his plans are. He's just managed to conjure this group of mindless followers because his plans are so abstract that they must be worth it. Yeah, Cyrus's plans don't end up making a whole lot of sense, and he comes off as kind of crazy and delusional. But hell if he hasn't got moxie. As ironic as it is, I like his spirit, and I think that his plans were supposed to come off as wild and nonsensical. Overall, the organisation of Team Galactic is probably one of my least favourites in the franchise, because they sort of just exist and they don't quite know why. But Cyrus is an evil character that I can appreciate. As has been the case with the last few generations, Platinum expands the story of the originals, whereas Emerald improved on Ruby and Sapphire by changing parts. Platinum doesn't take that approach, instead it adds stuff. More cutscenes and the awesomely twisted new area, the Distortion world, definitely put it above Diamond and Pearl. There are also a couple of characters exclusive to Platinum, one of which is Looker. If you've played any of the newer Pokemon games, there's a chance that this dedicated detective may look familiar. It's because Looker is one of the only characters in the Pokemon series who shows up across most of the games. His debut was in Platinum and he shows up numerous times. If you only played Diamond or Pearl, you missed out. Oh yeah, and if Steven is Bay, Cynthia is Bayer. Unsurprisingly, there isn't a great deal of story outside of beat the 8 gym leaders, defeat the evil team, and become the champion. But another thing I appreciate about the Generation 4 games is that there is plenty more to do between gyms than just walking from gym to gym battling trainers. Most of the prior games did a good job of this too, but there was a couple instances where there really wasn't anything to do in between gyms other than fight the trainers on the way and catch some Pokemon. In the Generation 4 games, there is always a spa with Team Galactic or an optional cave to explore along a checkpoint. The story is usually like, hold up, take care of this, then go on to the next gym. That might sound like it can get annoying, but the things that you do are meaningful and enjoyable. Like trekking through Iron Island or returning to the previously unexplored lakes to save legendary Pokemon. It helps the main story from feeling formulaic, and even though it makes these games longer than previous ones, they don't really feel like they are, nor do they overstay their welcome. An added benefit of these games being longer is that your Pokemon end up at really high levels towards the end, which means that your opponents have high level evolved Pokemon to compensate, so you get to see some of the coolest and strongest Pokemon on your way through the story, which is something that you only really see in past games via gym leaders, the Elite Four and the Champion. In Pokemon Platinum, even though you end up with high level Pokemon, it doesn't really prepare you for the hardest Elite Four yet. Each of the opponent's Pokemon have moves that counter their weaknesses, so if you're not outspeeding them, oof, good luck. Granted, I was underleveled during this playthrough, and it's probably possible to brute force your way through if your Pokemon are leveled enough. Even after the credits roll, there is still plenty to do in these games, and I'm not just talking about catching all the Pokemon. Like the Generation 2 games, the story carries on after the player becomes the champion. Now, don't get too excited, the extra areas in the Generation 4 games are nowhere near as good as being able to re-explore Kanto, but they're definitely not bad and are a worthwhile extension beyond the credits. That's just Diamond and Pearl. Platinum's post-game feels like a mix of the Generation 2 games and Emerald's. Not only are you treated to a new section of the map, but on that section sits a beloved place from Emerald, the Battle Frontier. Similarly to that game, the Battle Frontier is a meaty single-player version of competitive Pokemon. Unfortunately, it isn't quite as meaty as it was in Emerald, with only 5 facilities instead of 7. But this is still plenty of challenging content to sink your teeth into. And while some of the facilities are the same, such as the ever-present Battle Tower, there are some new ones with unique rule sets. But forget about the post-game for a second. The part of Sinnoh that the player journeys before seeing the credits is a joy to explore, with plenty of memorable locations such as Mount Coronet, the Spear Pillar, the Lost Tower, the routes leading up to Snowpoint City, the different lakes, the old chateau. Yeah, the world of the Gen 4 games is pretty good. I hate that Great Marsh though. A safari zone where you constantly get stuck in the mud. Great Marsh, more like not good marsh. Gonna need a burn hill for that one. I've noticed that I've had high praise for all of the first 4 Pokemon regions. I guess world design is just something that Game Freak are really good at. Although I think the Gen 4 games are a cut above the previous games in terms of their atmosphere, which is pulled off through a mix of the world design, visuals and sound. The music in these games is excellent, another huge step up from Gen 3. We're getting closer to the point where some tracks sound like they're using real instruments, a lot of piano and bass guitar. but there's a cool feature of these games' soundtracks that enhances the atmosphere. There are different versions of tracks that play depending on if it's daytime or nighttime. Most of the music is less upbeat and more relaxing at night. That, combined with the darker sky and the illumination of the street lights, creates a good atmosphere. Of course, spooky and cold places make for a good atmosphere too, and the Gen 4 games have these in spades. And if you're playing Platinum, it's both colder and spookier. I was also surprised that I found the oftentimes monotonous task of backtracking and returning to previous locations to be pretty fun and worthwhile in these games, and there are plenty of reasons to backtrack if you care about some of the optional stuff, such as reaping berries, checking on your honey trees, or taking part in timed events. Catching all of the Pokemon is another reason to revisit past areas, and this is especially true after finishing the game. Something I love about the Generation 4 games is that you earn the National Dex by seeing all of the Pokemon in the Sinnoh Dex. Seeing all of the Pokemon of a given region's Pokédex would have been hard in the past, as you'll likely end your journey with a ton of blank entries. However, this isn't the case this time around. Almost all of the Sinnoh Pokemon have been dispersed among all of the region's trainers, which not only makes seeing every Pokemon a fairly easy task, but it makes for much more variety in the Pokemon that you battle. Obtaining the National Dex opens up a bunch more options in the post-game for collecting Pokemon outside of the Sinnoh Dex. One of these options is the Pokéradar, which doubles as a way to track down rare Pokemon, as well as a method to increase your chances of finding shiny Pokemon. Then there are Swarms, where every day a new foreign Pokemon will show up to Sinnoh. The challenge of completing the Generation 3 Dex was that you had to track them down through a bunch of different games. In Generation 4, that is still the case to an extent, but they also made it possible to find a lot of the Pokemon in unique ways within the one game that you're playing, which I suppose may be more appealing to some people. In fact, I've only ever completed the National Dex in 2 Pokemon games, and one of them was Pokemon Diamond, and something that I did enjoy was how many unique ways there were to collect each Pokemon. Another cool feature of the game, and another method of filling up your Dex, is Dual Slot mode, which is a way for the DS game to communicate with a game in the Game Boy Advance slot of a DS or DS Lite. The main use of this is transferring Pokemon from the 3rd generation of games upward to the 4th gen games. For some reason you can only transfer 6 Pokemon a day per GBA game, which means it can take a while to get all of the ones you want in your copy of Pokemon Diamond, Pearl or Platinum, but I still love that this feature exists. Furthermore, a Pokemon GBA game in the GBA slot also allows access to the dongle method of Pokemon hunting. Depending on which of the 5 Pokemon games is in the GBA slot, different unique Pokemon will appear in certain locations of the Gen 4 games, which is another clever implementation of this dual slot mode. Originally, completing the Gen 4 Dex was a monumental task, as not only did it require tons of work in the games themselves, but you'd also have to transfer a bunch of exclusive Pokemon from the Generation 3 games. However, in 2009, Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver were released. With full compatibility with Diamond, Pearl and Platinum, this reduced the amount of effort needed exponentially, though by no means does it make it trivial. And there are still some Pokemon that need to be transferred from the previous generation in order to obtain, and you still have to play through Pokemon Ranger in order to get Manaphy. But enough about the non-native Pokemon, what about the new ones introduced in Sinnoh? Well, if you thought Gen 2 introduced too many evolutions or pre-evolutions of previous Pokemon, you might not like the Gen 4 Dex all that much. This gen went crazy overboard with that stuff, which I was happy about because I actually really like that. Unfortunately, the method of obtaining some of these new evolutions aren't all that creative. For most of them, it's simply use an evolutionary stone or trade it with a certain held item, stuff we've seen in the past. Some of them evolve by knowing a certain move, which is essentially another way of saying evolve them by level up, as they'll get that move eventually. Still, despite the unremarkable methods of obtaining, I do like a lot of the new evolutions, as well as the pre-evolutions, and appreciate their existence. Pop quiz, other than the DS's dual screens, what's one feature that sets it apart from the Game Boy Advance? Well, the microphone of course. The Gen 4 games did incorporate it in a wacky but fun way. With the Pokemon Chatot. Chatot can apparently imitate human speech with the move Chatter, and you use the DS's microphone to record a short voice clip that plays whenever Chatot cries. However, they made sure to distort the audio so much that you can't make out what's being said, as to protect our children's ears. Can you guess what I'm saying in this voice clip? It was the PIN number to my bank account. Reverse engineer that voice clip and steal all my money, I dare you. Yeah, joke's on you, I have no money. Anyone else think that Floatzel just looks like a hot dog? You're one generation too early, Floatzel. So you've got Bronzor here. Looks like a fairly harmless Pokemon, right? Nope. It's a psychic steel type, has massive defense and special defense, knows hypnosis and confuse ray. Its only 2 weaknesses are fire and ground, and it can have the levitate ability, so ground won't hurt it. Despite the lack of fire HMs, you need a fire Pokemon in your party just in case one of these Ronzors shows up to ruin your day. Event-only Pokemon are great, aren't they? Yes, their rareness seemed cool at the time, but all they stand for now are unused bits of code on a game cartridge. When I was watching videos of these games before their Western releases, I did stumble upon the videos showcasing the glitches where you surfed through the Elite Four to get to the areas housing the event-only Pokemon. Ah, the Flower Paradise, the Hall of Origin, Darkrai's Nightmare. How I long to experience these through legitimate means. Well, as a kid, I was actually lucky enough to attend the Darkrai and Shaymin events. But to my dismay, these events didn't distribute the items to enter these wonderful places. Instead, the Wi-Fi signals of my local Toys R Us just injected the Darkrai and Shaymin into my game, which is a far more boring way to go about doing it. These legendary Pokemon essentially had new scenarios to go along with them, complete with new dialogue and new areas. We just couldn't see it in our own games. At least in the UK anyway. Still, I suppose ignorance is bliss, and I guess if you never knew these parts of the game ever existed, you could still pick up the game today and get what you believe to be the full experience, right? Well, not really, as these events were not the only casualty of time. The other casualty has its own gravestone that is pointed out right near the start of the game. You see, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl were the first games to support Nintendo Wi-Fi connection. The global trade station stands tall in Jubilife City, but it is merely a ghost. I remember it like it was yesterday. I somehow managed to trade a Magikarp for a Ho-Oh. My brother traded a shiny Geodude for a Cherubi. Good times. I actually have fond memories of the Global Trade Station, or GTS for short. It basically allowed you to get any Pokemon you'd seen, provided someone was willing to accept what you were offering, or you had what someone else was asking for. It was also another way to get those version exclusive Pokemon if you didn't know anyone close by who had the games. The globe would even keep track of the countries that you were traded with, and it was the first time that Pokemon from foreign countries were available, so you could end up with some really bizarre nicknames. It was an exciting time. In Pokemon Platinum, the GTS saw an upgrade to the global terminal, where you could view battle replays, see random people's PC boxes, and play minigames. And now it is no more. This hurts even more than the events because you can see them in the game, you can access these facilities, you just can't connect. Unless you go behind Nintendo's back, but I'm not a naughty boy. There's always the local multiplayer features, and the Gen 4 games were the first games that had local wireless connection as a standard. Though I'm not dissing the Game Boy Advance wireless adapters, they were cool for the time. But now everyone's on the same level. We all have access to the Union Room and its wonderful new features. These games also introduced mixed battles, a new multiplayer format where you get to choose one Pokemon on your opponent's team to use in battle. There's also a decent new multiplayer area, the Underground, which is partially an expanded version of the secret bases from Gen 3, but much simpler and better in my opinion. You don't have to mix records with people just to have their secret base appear in your game. Instead, any player who's local can hop into the underground and have their base pop up for you to visit. It's also possible to take a pickaxe to the wall and play a fun minigame with people that could reward the player with evolutionary stones or rare fossils. Or, if you're not a fan of Halo, which, let's be honest, you are, you could even take part in some capture the flag in the underground, which is just a fun little extra that they added in. You can actually drop traps on the floor if you don't want people stealing your flag. Honestly, the underground's a bit of a novelty, but I do like its inclusion. I remember having a lot of fun with my friends when we played this in school. And I couldn't take my Xbox to school, this was all I had. And if you want even more multiplayer fun, Pokemon contests are back. Although I'm sure most people probably only played them in single player. They're a little different now, donning the rebranding of Pokemon Super Contests, and you can dress up your Pokemon now, if that's your thing. There's a fun rhythm minigame, and I do love my rhythm games. And the way to increase your contest stats is through this Cookin' Mama style minigame, and I do love some Cookin' Mama. The appeal portion of the contest, now known as the acting competition, is quite a bit different. The objective is still to use the correct moves and get lucky to score big points, but there are less opportunities to screw up your opponents, and for that reason I might give the edge to Generation 3's implementation of contests, despite the lack of a rhythm game and Cookin' Mama. And there we have most of my thoughts on the Generation 4 Pokemon games. I thought this was going to be a shorter one, but ooh, would you look at that timecode. Anyway, you probably know what I'm going to say next. Like the two generations that came before it, the best way to play Generation 4 today is with the Enhanced Edition. Pokemon Platinum's extra content and additional story elements puts it on top. If Platinum didn't exist, I'd be able to tolerate the slow battle speed of Diamond and Pearl, but because Platinum exists, there's no reason to put yourself through those sluggish games. Play Platinum. You know, I've always thought of the Generation 4 games as some of my favourites, and I was afraid that replaying them would make me realise that it was just because I sunk a ton of time into Diamond as a kid. But thankfully, that wasn't it. I love Sinnoh, I love the atmosphere, I love the music, I love the new Pokemon, and I love filling up the Pokédex. And this was actually the first time I played through the whole of Platinum, so not only did this playthrough reaffirm my love for this generation, it made me love it even more. Yeah, Pokemon Platinum, it's a good game. Oh, and thanks for watching. Pokemon is a good series, and boy, there's a lot of Pokemon games. Generation 5 is up next, so subscribe to see that one, and feel free to follow me on Twitch and Twitter, and as always, don't forget to have fun playing video games.